Ladies and gentlemen, the first session of the 7th edition of the World Policy Conference is about to begin. Please keep your seats. Thank you.
Ça marche? So from now on, I would like to remind you that there are two official languages for this meeting, qui sont le français et l'anglais. I will sometimes try to speak English, et à d'autres moments, j'essaierai de parler français. But to introduce, just to launch the discussion, I will say it in English, and later on, maybe Jean-David will speak French a little bit. Anyway, the idea of the first session, the initial idea of the first session was to have a global look at the global Eurasian continent in a large sense, and to compare the security situation at both ends of the continent. So I will ask Jean-David to speak first, because I know that he will take a very, very broad picture, and then I will take the floor to the other very distinguished speakers. We have very, very distinguished speakers, during the whole meeting, but for this first session, whom I present very quickly. So Jean-David is called in France diplomateur. Diplomateur, that means more or less a very great diplomat. I have never seen him stressed, under stress. It's a remarkable and quite unique situation. And he served under four French presidents. Richard Haas is extremely well known. He's one of the best known experts on international affairs in the United States. And he's currently the president of the New York and Washington now, but New York Council on Foreign Relations. And he was for several years, I didn't check how many, the director of the policy planning staff in the State Department, and author of many very well-known books. Han Sung-Joo is also an internationally known figure. And if I may say so, Sung-Joo, my oldest Korean friend, sorry, my friend of oldest standing, okay, more than 30 years, and he is a very well-known university professor, and he was a Minister of Foreign Affairs of Korea, an ambassador to the United States and many other very distinguished positions. We have Mr. Igor Morgulov, who is, I think, today the only official diplomat in office. That is, he's the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of the Russian Federation and in charge, responsible for Asian affairs. And I am also very grateful to him to have come for this meeting. And last but not least, Ambassador Oshima from Japan, who is also well-known, very distinguished diplomat and currently chairman of the Institute for International Economic Studies of Tokyo. So let me start with Jean-David, and I am sure we will have a very exciting discussion. Jean-David, tu as la parole.
Thank you very much, Thierry.
Ça, c'est pas du français.
No, I think it's better if I speak in English because everybody understands English, and the opposite with French, unfortunately, is not yet true. Maybe it will come someday, but it's great to be back in Seoul, and I think we have been privileged to hear a very important speech by the President of Korea. When I was thinking of this session, I tried to put on a piece of paper the differences which over the decades have framed the strategic situation between Europe and East Asia. And it seems to me that, in fact, we had very different experiences over the decades. Maybe today we are both confronted with the same kind of problem, which I could call the resurgence of the Monroe Doctrine. And then the question is, how can we deal with this new situation? But first, it seems to me that, yes, we had very different experiences after the Second World War and up to today. In Europe, to start with Europe, over the 5 decades, yes, we were divided with the Iron Curtain, but we didn't have war. We had crisis, the Budapest crisis in 1956, the Berlin Wall crisis in 1961, the Prague tragedy in 1968. These were moments of great tension, but certainly no war. Then we had the détente process, which led to the signature of the Helsinki Accord nearly 40 years ago already, and the foundation of the OSCE organization, which paved the way for cooperation between the two sides of Europe. And then started something that my neighbor on the left is a better place to describe, glasnost and perestroika, and the simple implosion of the Soviet Empire. There was no war again, so there were no winners and losers, in my view, only winners. And this was, for us, a kind of miracle. As a diplomat, frankly, if you had asked me in 1980, do you think that in your career you will see the total transformation of the continent with the disparition of the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain and all this, I would say, no, impossible. It did happen. That's a miracle. The second miracle is the construction of the European Union, based on the recognition of the bitter past. And beyond this recognition, we were in a position to build a better future for our countries based on the reconciliation between Germany and France. And when we started the unification process, we were only 6 nations representing 180 million people. And in front of us, we had the Soviet Empire with over 300 million people. And today, we are 28 countries in the European Union, representing more than 500 million people. And Russia, if I'm correct, is 146 million. So it's a strategic change of major amplitude. But we do consider in Europe that Russia is, for us, a necessary partner. Partner for peace, partner to build a better future. So that's the framework as it evolved in Europe. If you look at East Asia, it's a totally different picture. Because indeed, there were wars, starting with the war in Korea during 3 long years, and probably more than 2 million people dead. And so the legacy of this war, as Madam President said, is still there. And that's number one. Number two, there were the wars in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos for years and years. And so this legacy is very important. The legacy of the past is still there, and a bitter past, and it has an impact on the present. And the legacy of the Cold War is still there, also in another form, between Japan and Russia about some islands, between China and Taiwan, and of course, the division of the peninsula of Korea. So that's number one. It seems to me that number two is the return of China on the world scene. China was part of the Soviet bloc after the Second World War, and as you know, in 1961, there was kind of divorce between the Soviet Union and China. China decided to go alone. And then there was a huge changes of the strategic situation for the whole world, but especially for Asia, in 1972, with the visit of President Nixon in Beijing. I was, as a young diplomat posted in Beijing at that moment, it was really a major earthquake of strategic proportion. And then started the process of economic transformation. China is back on the world scene. China is, of course, emerging as the dominant power in the region and beyond. It is the most massive, rapid transformation of a society in history of mankind. And it has a huge impact on the whole region. And so today, it seems to me that both Europe and Asia are part of a world where the rule of law, the UN Charter, the capacity to solve problems together still exist. After all, we worked well to confront the financial crisis. Today, as we speak, our countries are in Lima trying to find a way to fight global warming. Together, we fight terrorism, we fight nuclear proliferation, piracy, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it seems to me that there is a new development which may have a big impact on the world order, what I called the return of the Monroe Doctrine. As you know, President Monroe in 1823 stated that, well, no outside powers should interfere in the Americas, because this was for the United States to deal with the problems which may emerge in the Americas. It seems to me that today we have a kind of return of the Monroe Doctrine in Asia with the rise of China, and in Europe with the resurgence of Russia as a major actor. Probably, I'm very cautious saying that, it happens in different ways. It seems to me that for China, what is important is to make sure that its prominence is recognized and accepted in the region. Zhongguo, the empire of the middle, has always considered that they had a paramount role to play in their region, that the role of all those living around China was to come to the court of the emperor and pay tribute and go back to their cities illuminated by Chinese civilization, in a way. I'm going a bit too far, but and then this is still in the mind of the Chinese leaders, and when you see the confrontation about small islands, the Senkaku Tiaoyu and South China Sea, it's less about fish, oil, and gas. It's more about sovereignty, and even more about prominence. For Russia, but maybe my neighbor will speak about it, it seems to me that President Putin wants to rebuild the Russian Empire as it was during the days of Catherine the Great or Stalin. And of course, for us, it's a major challenge in Europe. But I'll conclude, Thierry, in few words to say, it seems to me that it's difficult to solve the problems in the same way in the two regions. For obvious reasons, China is so important, so big, so powerful, that it's difficult to build organization, and I heard the 3 initiatives which were presented by the President of Korea. I think it's very important, a very positive way forward. For us in Europe, it seems to me that it's most important to first continue dialogue and dialogue and dialogue. This is true for both regions. And I was very happy when I saw that President Hollande went to Moscow 2 days ago. It's very important to reaffirm the principles on which the international order is built. It's very important also to consider that we have to stay together and build a better future together, EU and Russia. And that Ukraine must remain the bond of friendship and cooperation between Russia and the European Union. It is possible. For that, you need negotiation. That's what I experienced when President Sarkozy, after the invasion of Georgia in 2008, rushed to Moscow and Tbilisi, and we obtained important results. And you remember in Evian in 2008, with President Medvedev at the time, we were very pleased with the evolution. But in all this, and that's my last remark, there is one actor we need, and this is the US. The US, in my view, both in Europe and in Asia has to play the role of the balancing power. Like the UK, I would say, in Europe in the 19th century. The US has to remain the ultimate guarantor of peace. NATO is back because of Ukraine. And it's very important that we have confidence in our most important partner and ally. And I think it's the same in East Asia for countries like Japan and Korea, of course. And here I have a question mark after what happened in Syria last August last year, when there was a red line about the non-use of chemical weapons, and the use of chemical weapons happened, and there was no action. And I think it sent an unfortunate message to not only the countries in the region, but well beyond. So I'll conclude on that, and again, I'm delighted to be with you today. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean-David. So it is a natural transition towards Richard Haas. Let me emphasize two things. Well, first, on the Monroe Doctrine, I would like also Richard to comment on that. But this is exactly why in my introductory speech this morning, I said that the New World Order, if there is one, should not be a division of the world into spheres of influence. I think that's something that we have to discuss not only today, but during the next the 3 days. Second, on the US, so we are going to listen to Richard Haas, but tomorrow we have also a lunch debate where Richard Haas and Joseph Nye will talk about the issue of American leadership or lack of leadership. And also we will have on Wednesday Bob Gates, the former defense secretary of both Bush and Obama, who will, there will be a 1-hour discussion with him. So there will be several opportunities to turn around these issues. So Richard, the floor is yours.
Merci.
Continue in French now.
This reminds me of when Thierry and I were starting out in our careers, and it was, we would be speaking in English, he and his colleague, but as soon as the meeting began, the official meeting began, they were all forced to switch to French as part of the, one of the 2 official languages of NATO. So I'm not sure this is progress or not, but we'll stay in English. Look, during the 20th century, Europe was the central theater of international relations, and it was all too interesting. It brought us 2 world wars and a Cold War. And the good news is, with one exception now and potential exceptions later, Europe will not play nearly as dynamic or central or turbulent a role in the 21st century. And that's a good thing. I used to describe one of my jobs when I worked for President Bush the father, which was to make the Middle East normal and boring. And needless to say, I failed miserably. But I think people who worked on Europe, for the most part, succeeded. And the reasons, and it gets into some of the differences with Asia. You've had several things that are that explain the European success, in addition to one thing which is more uncomfortable to talk about, which is exhaustion. And the exhaustion of the 2 world wars and, to some extent, the Cold War. One, though, is Franco-German reconciliation. At the core of modern Europe was the Franco-German relationship, and then this chain of institutional developments with the coal and steel community and the European community, leading to the European Union. And I simply point this out because there's nothing in any way parallel in Asia. You've not had even the basic elements of Japanese, Chinese, or Japanese, Korean reconciliation. Whereas a lot of European history was about also territorial disputes, whether Alsace-Lorraine or other issues. In Asia, virtually every major country has territorial disputes to this day with other major countries. Whether it's the things that have gotten a lot of attention recently over islands and the rest, but whether Japan and Russia, still haven't dealt with their World War II legacy. Japan and, China and India still have border issues, and on and on. So there's been nothing like the diplomatic reconciliation or dealing with the past in Asia that there's been in Europe. It really is fundamentally different. And then on top of that, in Europe, you've had a degree of institutionalization, whether it is the EU, NATO, what originally was CSE, then OSCE. You have had a degree of institutionalization that is unprecedented and unparalleled. And while there's been a degree of institutional development in the Asia-Pacific, much less. For many reasons, the geography is much more complicated, so it's harder to design systems. You haven't had some of the same impulses. But the fact is, it's a much less institutionalized region. In Europe now, you've got very low levels of defense spending. Virtually none of the NATO partners spends even 2% of its GDP on defense. That is not, shall we say, a problem, quote unquote, in Asia. In Europe, you have elements of nationalism, but it's largely now right-wing populist nationalism, I think resulting from the current economic difficulties. The rise of nationalism in Asia is something very different and much more profound. It's not simply, I believe, a reaction to economic stagnation, but I think it is something much more to do with the emergence of strong nation states. The immediate security challenge to Europe is one that we didn't think we'd be talking about 25 years ago. This year is the 25th anniversary of the coming down of the wall, the effective end of Cold War, which is the question of what to do about Russia. I would simply say, though, that I think parallels to the Cold War are dramatically overdrawn. I simply do not think they are in any way accurate. Russia does pose security challenges, but it's not to Europe's core. I would say it's to what you might call Europe's periphery, where Europe's periphery overlaps with Russia's periphery. And I think there is the question of what, if any, special influence Russia has in that area. And I would think that the outlines of a response to Russia are clear, that on one hand, one needs to make NATO and the core of Europe strong. So Russia has neither the temptation nor the ability to challenge its independence and stability. On the other hand, the purpose of Western policy should not be to isolate Russia, but it should be to integrate Russia. And this includes, but is not limited to Ukraine. So I do think this is still a diplomatic challenge. And one of the interesting questions, among other things, is whether the sharp drop in oil prices, which I believe will be lasting, whether the weakening of the ruble and so forth, far more than the sanctions, provide a context in which diplomacy actually can flourish. And I think it has the potential to, but obviously it depends heavily on Mr. Putin. But again, the challenges for the foreseeable future to Europe's stability and security are limited. They're largely at the edge, and which is all very different than what we see in Asia. And as I said, it's a much more complex geography, much less institutionalism, far more territorial and other disputes, far less dealing successfully with the past. If one looks at, for example, the German social collective cultural experience of dealing with the past, and one looks at what's happened, or what's happening in Japan, I think there are significant differences. There are several, though, geopolitical challenges in Asia, which I think are far more urgent and difficult than Europe. One Jean David alluded to, which is the rise of China. But I would simply say I think a lot of the analysts get it wrong. I'm at least as concerned about Chinese weakness as I am strength. And how does China cope with its many internal challenges? And what is the consequences of dealing with those internal challenges from much lower levels of economic growth to the demographic challenges, to the environmental challenges, to what to do about corruption, to shifting the economic model from an export model to a domestic demand model? What will be the consequences of that for Chinese external behavior? So it's not simply the rise of China that I believe is a consideration. It's also in many cases the tribulations of China. And what does that mean for Chinese behavior in the region? Secondly, there is the divided peninsula, which is an anomaly. I thought the emphasis that the president this morning made on reunification was both right and noteworthy, though again I believe that brings us back to China. I am not an enthusiast for, in my predictions for North Korea giving up its nuclear weapons as much as I would like to see that. North Korea doesn't have much other than nuclear weapons, so why it would give up its principal piece of leverage, you would have to be an optimist to believe that. I think the real question for North Korea is much more fundamental. How do we bring about diplomacy that brings about the end of the division of the Korean Peninsula? And this brings us back to Beijing. China may not have control over North Korea, but it has more influence over North Korea than anybody else, in particular given North Korea's trade patterns. And the real question is, what would it take for China to see the division of the peninsula is not serving its interests? And what could, in particular, people in Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington say to people in Beijing that would persuade it that the current situation is potentially more threatening to Chinese national security than a unified peninsula? And I believe that is the strategic challenge. So we can continue to throw diplomats at the challenge of denuclearizing North Korea. Again, I am not wildly optimistic. I do believe that we have to attack the fundamentals of the divided peninsula. Just very quickly, I'd say one or two other things. I do believe we have to think creatively about institutions in this part of the world. And again, it's not to take what worked in Europe and think we can simply apply it here. We have to adapt it and rethink some of those. But this part of the world, while it's developed an awful lot in the way of economic institutions, it has not developed diplomatic or political military institutions in any way that are adequate to the challenge. So many people here do not work in government. One of the challenges, I believe, for outsiders is to be creative about what would an Asia-Pacific security architecture look like? What is feasible? What is desirable for this region of the world? Because again, if there are parallels to pre-World War I Europe, they're not to be found in Europe. They're not to be found in the Middle East, which has its own issues, shall we say, but they're to be found here. And I believe that the diplomatic architecture, shall we say, is inadequate. Lastly, the question of my own country, the United States. We'll talk about it maybe tomorrow. I'm uneasy with the parallels to the Monroe Doctrine that was developed in a certain time, in a certain geography. The idea that in any way it's applicable to China in Asia or Russia in Europe leaves me very, very uneasy. So I would not suggest that as a useful way to go. I think actually it does get at questions of spheres of influence, or if I may borrow, am I allowed to use a French phrase in front of you? Whether what kind of rights of assertion and rights of preference do we give to countries like China and Russia? What is, if you will, a realistic degree of respect, and what is a degree where we need to, where a droit de regard for what it is they want would go too far? And I think that's, again, a legitimate question for diplomacy. I would agree, though, neither one of these regions, at the end of the day, my last point, neither one is self-organizing. Neither one, if left to its own devices, and I hope this doesn't sound arrogant, but both need the United States. The United States has every reason to be involved because the United States has powerful interests in both. So I don't think the task intellectually or for diplomacy is to devise post-American systems, but rather it's to evolve systems in both that continue to include the United States. And the goal should be to make sure that Europe does not again get interesting, and that Asia does not get all too interesting as we move forward.
Thank you very much, Richard. We are going to have the next session, actually, is on the Korean Peninsula. We will concentrate entirely on the Korean Peninsula, and we will certainly go a little deeper into this issue. Let me also emphasize one of the many substantial points you made, which is about China. just two quick points. One, first, I think you're absolutely right. You know, people are equally feared by a too strong a China or too weak a China. And the history of China shows that there are regularly catastrophic developments if there is, for instance, a major economic crisis, something like that. And the second point, I was just in Beijing before coming here in small, relatively high-level meeting, and my impression was that they do not know really yet how to position themselves in the issue of global governance. So maybe this is, I'm sure this is something that we will have to discuss also in the next 2 days. So now let me move to our host country and to Sung-Joo. And then I will continue with Mr. Morgulov, who represents Russia, which has 2 feet, you know, one in Asia and, of course, one in the West. And last but not least, Mr. Oshima. So, Sung-Joo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. In deference to the title of this session, which is Security Governance in East Asia and Europe, let me try to draw a brief and rough comparison between security situation and structure in Europe and that in Asia. In the post-Cold War era, Europe has constructed what can be considered as a security structure, including OSCE, although of late it seems that it is becoming increasingly of little use and help. The only security structure Asia has consisted of an alliance system, which one side, the allies themselves, claim to be in the interest of peace and stability, and the other side, China in particular, considers provocative and destabilizing. As for the alliance system, there is a multilateral alliance in Europe, at least on one side, called NATO. In Asia, there are bilateral alliances with the United States as the hub or as the linchpin. In Europe, Russian behavior is increasingly becoming, and I agonized over the description, assertive and confrontational, whereas in Asia, China, while strengthening its military capabilities, still considers cooperation with the other side important and useful in both the economic and security fields. In Asia, what can be considered pre-21st century geopolitics did not disappear even after the demise of the Cold War. In Europe, if geopolitics was receding for a while, it seems to be returning with vengeance in a way that is more naked than in Asia. With this backdrop in mind, let me try to talk about how each of the major countries in East Asia takes or reacts to 2 security-related phenomena, the rise of China and what is known as America's rebalancing to Asia policy. With this rebalancing policy, the United States appeared to be placing more weight to its Asia policy and presence, but now finds itself with problems elsewhere on the globe, including Ukraine, Syria, the Islamic State, and Afghanistan, from which it is difficult to pivot away. Neither has the United States quite decided how it will compete and cooperate with potential and perceived adversaries. For example, the United States is overly sensitive to whether a country is becoming pro-China or pro-US. With this zero-sum mindset, the United States seems to regard, for example, a country joining the TPP to be pro-US and to join China-initiated plans such as the AIIB to be pro-China. China exhibits two-faced attitudes, sometimes simultaneously and sometimes in sequence. China wants to find ways to cooperate with the United States, but is also in a hurry to bring changes to the status quo. To others, such as ASEAN, China says it wants inclusiveness and consultation while looking after their comfort level. But China cannot resist the temptation to flex muscles and exhibit a big power attitude. China wants its newly gained power recognized, but still feels being pushed, contained, and encircled. Japan finds China's rise uncomfortable, and the United States overloaded with problems worldwide and at home. In such a situation, Japan also finds the need, justification, and even the opportunity to strengthen security cooperation with the United States and elevate its own military capability and role. The problem and dilemma for Japan is that it is pursuing this policy without accompanying success in reconciling and building trust and confidence with its neighbors, as the Japanese leadership seems to be becoming more regressive in historical outlook. Korea still finds the threat from North Korea evident and present, what with its nuclear weapons programs, missile capabilities, belligerent rhetoric, and unpredictable leadership. South Korea welcomes the U.S.'s rebalancing to Asia policy, an important part of which is maintaining and strengthening bilateral alliances. It also helps to buffer Korea's tension with Japan. Korea would also like to see more attention and effort given by both China and the United States to limiting and ultimately removing North Korea's nuclear weapons capabilities. As for security-related structures, it is true that Asia did not inherit them from the past or build new ones. But Asia has had an alliance system led by the United States. The United States and its allies claim that the alliances are for balance, while China suspects that they are for containment. From an objective perspective, however, neither the US-led alliance system nor security guarantees that the US provides, such as the extended deterrence, is always disadvantageous to China. I think this is true at present as well as in the future. For one thing, the nuclear deterrence and the alliances will have the effect of continuing to bind US allies, including Japan, as non-nuclear weapon states. Furthermore, by giving security assurances to allies, it has had the positive effect of actually deterring potential conflicts and wars. To the criticism that the alliances are a relic of the Cold War, there is the response that in Europe, NATO is expanding and thriving even after the end of the Cold War. All the same, Asia has to deal with the territorial disputes between China and Japan, frictions over history between Japan and Korea, mutual suspicions and rivalry between China and the United States, the North Korean nuclear issue, and worsening relations between Russia and the United States, as well as the conflicts in the Middle East, including that with the Islamic State spilling over to Asia. These are problems that, even if Asia had some kind of multilateral security structure, it would have been difficult to handle, much less to resolve. For the time being, the one thing that keeps any of these situations flare up into a more dangerous one is the realization by the leaders that they are all interdependent in economic and security matters. They also recognize that they cannot afford to get into actual military conflict against one another. In the meantime, the alliance system in Asia still serves as an important and useful element of the security structure, not only for the allies in the system themselves, but also for the non-allies outside of it as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Sung-Joo, for this also extremely rich intervention. Let me ask you briefly two two questions. First, this morning I made, today, you know, if there were a major incident, such as, you know, for instance, Chinese vessel coulant, comment est-ce qu'on dit, sinking a Japanese vessel or vice versa, or some incident between Korea and Japan, what would happen? Or what could happen? What would be the worst case scenario? The question number one. Second, I made a slip this morning in my speech, which made everybody laugh, including the president. And I said that it was on purpose, which of course it was not, but it was nevertheless, in the sense that, do you think there is a chance of something between Japan and Korea similar to the process which seems to be starting between Japan and China? And also I want to emphasize one of your points, that the possible contamination of Asia and East Asia, of the Middle East situation, which for a number of reasons, I think that's a very important point that we might also discuss later on. But could you make brief comments on the first two questions? No, you can do that now. Yeah, I was going to. No, I don't want to give you time to think too much.
Well, on the first question, obviously I don't know much about the details. I don't think it was anything planned and schemed in advance. In any case, there has been a move on the part of both the Japanese and Chinese leadership to play down their conflict and to find some common ground. And since they are very much dependent economically, and also there's so much stake in continuing good and close relations between the two countries, even with the competition and suspicions of each other. So I don't really think this event will blow over into a major conflict of any kind. On the second question, as you heard, the President mentioned the possibility of a three-way summit meeting between Japan, China, and among Korea. And actually, short of a summit meeting, everything else has been going on between Japan and Korea. The ministerial meetings, all kinds of negotiations and consultations. And so I sometimes wondered why people place so much emphasis on the summit meeting, which is very often very symbolic. And it is something that the Korean president, for either moral, political, or whatever reasons, cannot bring herself into going into, since we have all the other contacts and communication going on with Japan, that should probably not be made into such a big issue. But as you heard this morning, the president is trying to find a way into even having summit meeting with the Japanese leader. So I feel fairly optimistic.
Thank you very much. I remind you that tonight the dinner is hosted here in this very place by the current Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Yoon Byung-se. And I'm sure that we will continue this discussion with him, and starting from this morning's speech of President Parguenier. And I am sure also that Ambassador Oshima will make his comments when his turn comes on some of these issues. One point also I wanted to make is talking about Japan being denuclearized and so forth and so on. I think we should remind that Japan has reached the nuclear threshold state, which is not nothing. And that also should be part of our thinking. So now let me give the floor to Mr. Morgulov, who has, as I said, has 2 feet. I mean, Russia has 2 feet, the Asian foot and the European one. So the floor is yours.
I do also have 2 feet.
But maybe you have 3.
No, just thank you, Terry. Thank you very much. And first of all, let me thank organizers for invitation to address such a distinguished audience. I was named the only acting diplomat here, but I see a lot of friends and colleagues whom I met in my life and my career in different positions in the various parts of the world. So I feel myself among colleagues and in the right place. In the Russian Foreign Ministry, I am in charge for Asian policy. So in my presentation, I will make accent on Russia's vision on the ways how to ensure security in Northeast Asia. But before that, responding to what just been said by my colleagues, I would like to note that we should understand that we live in a time of fundamental transformation of the system of international relations. And this explains the growing number of conflicts. This explains the multifaceted and dramatic challenges and threats that we are now facing. This is not because of the Russia's assertiveness or confrontational behavior, as colleague Sung-Joo said, or it's not obviously desire of President Putin to restore Russian empire. It's the era of unipolarity goes to history. And I believe that should leave nobody to doubt. New balance of power is establishing, and with this grow global competition, often unfair, often aggressive. And also let us not forget about the rivalry of values. This is also a very important issue that we all are now facing. I mean, moral values and things like that. And in this background, certain states' claims for global leadership are accompanied by aspirations to make the whole world to suit their interests, to impose on others their own visions, how to live, how to do domestic politics. And these policy often ignore domestic specifics, local traditions, national specifics. So-called colored revolutions, initiated or supported from abroad, are no less than policy of regime change, and or so-called export of democracy. The slogan that is, in my view, rather destructive than constructive if we think of its influence on international relations and multiplication of crisis zones. Situation in the Ukraine, in my view, is a tragic example of this short-sighted policy of those who advocates geopolitical engineering. And let me assure you that given common history and many centuries of life together with the Ukrainian people, no one in the world is more interested in ensuring earliest possible restoration and peace and security and stability in Ukraine than Russia. And obviously, reaching this goal is in the interest of Europe and the rest of the world. And Russia has been and will continue to do everything to promote political settlement in Ukraine, the road to which lies in the all-encompassing national dialogue with participation of all regions and all political forces in that country. Russia, you're absolutely right. We have 2 feet, or we prefer to say we have 2 heads as our national emblem. Eagles looks towards east and west. We are situated both in Europe and Asia, and therefore we need to strengthen, we feel that the need to strengthen mechanism of global security, especially sharply. And as you rightly mentioned, it took decades to build an instrument of maintaining security in Europe. And by now, they have grown into a certain system, which is not perfect. And the Ukrainian crisis proves that this tuned mechanism fails from time to time. At this background, we are concerned that no mechanisms at all on security have been established in Asia-Pacific. And Russia believes it is becoming increasingly urgent to elaborate common rules of conduct which would promote atmosphere of cooperation, trust, and mutual understanding, preventing confrontation and unhealthy competition, which I mentioned. The importance of building advanced, sustainable, and robust security architecture in the region was underlined by all leaders of ASEAN countries and its dialogue partners, including Russia, China, United States, in their speeches in the recent EAS summit in Naypyidaw. I was there, and I was really delighted to hear all major countries' leaders participating in this meeting made this notion. Russia proceeded from this very understanding when it proposed last year, with support of China and Brunei, initiative on framework principles on strengthening security and developing cooperation in the Asia-Pacific region. Substantial steps in carrying out this idea have already been made. We had 3 seminars, one in Moscow, in Bandar Seri Begawan, and one in Jakarta. They clearly demonstrated the urgency and importance of such dialogue. By the way, our proposal correlates to other national initiatives of such kind. We all remember Chairman Xi Jinping's initiative on new security in Asia, which he took forward during SICA meeting in Shanghai in May. There is also Indonesian initiative on Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. There are some ideas of our Indian friends on Asia-Pacific security. So altogether we have, and also of course we heard today the ideas of President of Republic of Korea, Madam Park Geun-hye, her initiatives. So altogether may provide basis for some, synergy of all these proposals, and on this basis we can start serious dialogue on how to proceed with security arrangements in this part of the world. Russia is firmly determined to continue this work with a view to establish a common instrument of ensuring security in the Asia-Pacific, the need for which will increase steadily as the role of the region in global affairs grows. As a major objective for the future, we see conclusion of legally binding document, some kind of treaty or agreement on security in the greater Asia-Pacific region. Of course, we are not idealists. We understand that it is easier to say than to do, and this task probably can be reached by step by step at a pace comfortable to all. But we believe that this should be set as a goal of our movement towards realizing this security initiative. I wouldn't dwell on Korean Peninsula, since we have next session devoted to the issues of this region, but we obviously understand that situation in this particular area of the world is especially important to security arrangements. And I also believe that the problem here is that we have all division lines here. You mentioned, Thierry, that we don't need to make new division lines, but here we have all division lines, and it is necessary to remove them. And by the way, these division lines are legacy of the Cold War, and they are ideological ones, and still, why they're not removed, we cannot achieve anything in building effective security system in this sub-region. So I think that we should elaborate the idea of launching kind of sub-regional Helsinki process here in Northeast Asia. But again, I believe that could be discussed more in details during the next session. So in conclusion, I just want to underscore that Russia's policy in Asia-Pacific does not have any hidden agenda. We are open and transparent. Our main goal is to establish here a system of interstate relations which would fully correspond with the present realities and respect interests of all countries of the region. And this should be done on the basis of broad dialogue with participation of maximum number of regional players. And this system should provide opportunities for development of multilateral trade, economic and investment cooperation, overcome existing security challenges, prevent emergence of new threats, and promote creation of integrated economic and political space. We are open for this cooperation, and I believe we have everything we need to achieve this goal. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Igor. That's a very interesting intervention. Let me ask you two brief questions. First, when you use the term geopolitical engineering, could you elaborate a little bit more on what you mean with this unusual expression? Second, you know that the first World Policy Conference in Evian in 2008, President Medvedev was there, as Jean-David reminded, and he made a speech which personally I thought was very important, proposing, to update the Helsinki, the CSC, the CSC treaty of 40 years ago. We'll commemorate next year the 40th anniversary of the CSC. So my question is, from the Russian viewpoint, is the proposal of updating the CSC process still on the table?
Speaking on geopolitical engineering, sometimes we feel that someone, and I wouldn't name these forces, are interested in getting some political experiments, in geopolitical experiments, and sitting far away from the places where these events are taking place. These people, just like playing some games, with the serious issues, with the lives of people, as we can see in Ukraine, for example.
Would you say, sorry to interrupt you, would you say that Zbigniew Brzezinski is the kind of man who likes geopolitical engineering?
I wouldn't prefer to name names here, but...
No, but that's a name among others.
But you know the names.
The great chessboard.
You know names. I wouldn't name them. But again, this is quite serious. This is quite serious issue, and we believe that it is really important to understand that we cannot play with these issues like security in Asia, in Europe, like security in Asia as well. This is too important to be issue for geopolitical engineering. And secondly, I'm sorry, I didn't get your second question. You were mentioning which initiative?
The question is the idea of updating the CSC still, which was the substance of President Medvedev's speech in Evian in October 2008, the first World Policy Conference. Is this proposal still on the agenda, on the table, from the Russian viewpoint?
Let me come back to this question later. I'm not sure I'm ready to give you an answer right now, but I can.
If you, that I think would be...
Check it with my colleagues
okay, I think
you know.
that if you could check it before you leave.
Yeah, sure.
Give us a hint. That could be quite interesting, I think.
I'll give you my answer.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
So now I give the floor to Mr. Oshima, an old friend too of the WPC. And I think you have an easy task. But let me provoke you a little bit, because just for fun, you know, just to stimulate, not for fun, but to stimulate the discussion. You know, Japan under Prime Minister Abe is sometimes criticized for being a bit nationalistic and a bit, certain commentators would say, aggressive, and so. So could you answer those worries? Not only in Korea.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and 안녕 하십니까 to my friends in Korea. It's very nice to be back. As you may know, I was ambassador here some years ago. As you started by saying, it's a very difficult position I'm in to be at the last of the distinguished speakers, and particularly after a very major, very important speech by President Park Geun-hye. And unfortunately, I had prepared a text, but now much have been covered by my colleagues and everybody else. I will try to improvise as much as possible. First of all, your question, which is very interesting, and I'm sure it's out there, so I might need to address that too. But in trying to, I will try to answer it and respond to it by maybe bringing a little bit of a big picture. People talked about the difference between East Europe and East Asia in terms of the Cold War and afterwards. If you remember that much of East Asian security structure was dominated by the West for centuries. So what is now happening here is the fact that the Western influence receding, and that results in certain things, not just the rise of China, but it exposes the fact that we have not had an East Asian security structure which was independent of a global structure. That's one. That's why we are still at the very beginning of how to develop its own security structure. That's why the road nerves are showing at the very moment when the older structure is receding. Now, one element which some people don't see is the fact that the Cold War had internal domestic implications in much of the countries in East Asia, Japan particularly. If you remember, during the Cold War times, we had a very strong Marxist, communist, socialist parties. After the end of the war, end of the Cold War, and the end of the, should I say, the prestige of the communist ideology, that element has been gone in Japan, inside Japan. And therefore, from outside, you will see the center of political gravity is moving to the right. But that doesn't change the basic structure of the ideology and policies pursued by the conservative government. So from the outside, you might think people are moving towards the right, but it's not. It's just that much of the vocal left has been disappearing. That's one element. So I would not think that you should be concerned too much about let me put it this way. I don't think there's any truth to this assertion that Japan is moving towards militarism or nationalistic, ultra-nationalistic ideas. No, there are, of course, certain voices, but that's not where the center of gravity of Japanese political structure is. So there's no worry about that on that score at all. And there's no regression into that side. Now, so having more or less try to respond to what you mentioned, and not going into the details of how East Asia is different. I try to cover this, but it has been already covered by our distinguished colleagues. Let me skip that. And one element, most important, is, of course, the rise of China. That creates all sorts of instability in this region. But we are an ally of the United States. We welcome this American rebalancing to Asia. We try to contribute to the increased security in this area by doing our bit, like strengthening our military, as well as to changing the interpretation of the Constitution so that we can take certain measures of collective self-defense. So we are trying to contribute to this whole process. But having said that, let me just make one observation, which I think will be very interesting for me and maybe for others who have not noticed necessarily on this aspect, which is the importance of the need to follow the rule of law in order to have a domestic economic governance much more understood by the external community, which would be important for the economic reforms in certain countries which need economic reforms. That has to do with, of course, China. But let me just start by saying a few things. The modus operandi of Russia in Ukraine does have ramifications here in East Asia. A couple of things. We already mentioned the Northern Territories issue between Japan and Russia. If the nationalistic attitude is strengthened in this aspect, that the resolution will become much more difficult, despite the fact that there has been agreement that we should pursue this on the principles of law and justice. And in this respect, what is happening in Russia recently, particularly on the economic side, is very disconcerting, but at the same time might be giving certain hint to other people, because much of the fact that Russia does not have, if I may say so, with my due deference to our Russian colleague, sufficient economic governance does send negative message to all the economic players outside, naming investors, capital, and investors. Likewise, how the nation conducts itself in the international arena without respect of the international law and without much economic governance based on law will have impact on how they would try to resolve the issue of economic reform. And I see this in China. I think there seems to be a silver lining in China, that nationalistic overreach, as we have been seeing in East China Sea area or South China Sea area, is being tempered by the domestic need for serious economic and social reform. And I would like to stress the importance, in my view, of the decision by the fourth plenum of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China taken last October, which emphasized the importance of the rule of law, albeit with Chinese characteristics. The decision seems to have been based primarily on the need for domestic economic and social reform. Nevertheless, it also implies realization that unless there's a transparent and democratic governance under the principle of rule of law, international capital will take a serious cautionary view on China's domestic prospects. Of course, there's still a considerable gap between pursuit of domestic governance based on the rule of law with Chinese characteristics and the reining in of the dangerous challenges to the freedom of navigation or the territorial integrity of neighbors. However, it seems obvious that if such disruptive actions continue in its neighborhood, the risk-averse capital will not be available to help the needed economic reforms inside China. The jury is still out on the question of how to develop the security governance in East Asia in response to the challenge brought about by rapid rise of and attendant exuberance of nationalistic pride in China. However, it should be noted that there seems to be a willing interlocutor for the strategic dialogue on security and economic cooperation. This is where I would like to stress the importance of the meeting between the two leaders of Japan and China, Prime Minister Abe and President Xi. It happened about a month ago, and it was obviously the step in the right direction. And it opened doors and opened the hearts and minds of some people. I was just in Beijing or in China and met some Chinese people as well, and it seems that that meeting has broken ice among the minds of the people who wanted to have a ordinary, regular contact and dialogue and relationship with Japan. So this was an important step. And of course, at the top level as well, we'll be continuing dialogue. And as has been stressed a number of times, dialogue is the first step towards whatever security governance we need to establish. In this respect, I think that the Japanese government itself is very much welcoming the initiative made by President Park Geun-hye, which was reiterated during her speech just this morning. And with these steps, we would hope that dialogue would continue and it would be deepened and eventually lead to a much better system here in the East Asia as well. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Also, one short question. How do you react on the regular protests from Korea, in particular, and China on the Yasukuni shrine visits? What is your interpretation of that? Why is it so important for the Prime Minister of Japan to do this sort of moves which are perceived outside as provocations?
That's an interesting question and maybe an important one. But my view is that it's a very complicated, obviously it's a complicated issue, but sometimes it's not well understood where the real issue is. The real issue is not the visit of the Prime Minister or any of the political leaders to Yasukuni itself, but what Yasukuni represents to China. And particularly the fact that there were so-called war criminals. I don't want to use the word enshrine because it has a totally different meaning, but that's the only English word I can understand use here. Until some time ago, those people who were made, determined as war criminals and therefore sometimes executed, were not part of the soldiers who died for the country enshrined at Yasukuni. So it's only a natural feeling for anybody in Japan. Well, I shouldn't say anybody, but most people in Japan who would find it totally natural for the leader, political leader, or anybody to pay their respects to the past soldiers who died in the past wars for the nation. The only problem is that China sees it as an offense because now, after some years, the war criminals who were supposed to be responsible for the war in China and elsewhere were also included, and therefore it seems as if the respect expressed by the leaders to the dead soldiers and sailors implies this aspect which cannot, for them, accepted. So there's this very complicated issue. For Japan, if that issue can be resolved, that would be much better, but at the moment, the political leaders find it almost natural for them to pay their respects, and that it's the way I think many leaders would do so in other countries as well, except for that particular element.
Do you think that there could be sometime in the future a reconciliation process, more or less, between Japan, China, and Korea, more or less comparable to the French-German reconciliation process? Is it something conceivable?
Oh, of course. If I'm not mistaken, as was mentioned earlier, French-German reconciliation was made almost imperative by the changing security circumstances immediately after the war, meaning the rise of the Cold War. That kind of a security situation was not present here because China was on the other side instead of on the same side. So now that the Cold War is over, now that things are sort of people are positioning from different angles, eventually, yes, I would say yes. And we have started a dialogue. That's a very important step.
Let me say that if there is not, of course, this time, but sometime in the future, if the World Policy Conference can play any role to facilitate these sort of things, we would be very happy to do it.
Yes, yes.
Okay. Now we have time for, unfortunately, not so many questions, but if there is anyone, so Ambassador Wu Jianmin from China.
Thank you, Thierry. I'm maybe the only Chinese in the room. At this stage, maybe I have to inject a few thoughts. First, about Yasukuni Shrine. Ambassador Oshima, you say it's a complicated issue. It's not complicated. The substance, Japan has to come to terms with the history. Just suppose today, German Chancellor will go to somewhere to honor the memory of Adolf Hitler. What will happen next? Next day, she or he has to step down. Because when people mention Hitler, we remember Holocaust. 6 million Jews died from it. You know, Yasukuni Shrine, you honor 14 Class A war criminals there. That's the problem. Sino-Japanese War, how many people died from it? 5 times Holocaust. So this is a problem, not complicated. You say Chinese are angry, not only Chinese, even your American allies are not happy about it. This is the truth. My second point is, you know, we need to look at the large picture. Today, when we look around the world, I'm seeing 3 focal points. The first focal point is turbulence. I mean, epicenter of turbulence, regional war, and hatred is located in the Northern Africa and the Middle East. It's very unfortunate. This is a big issue facing the world. Second focal point, I believe that the epicenter of financial crisis is in Europe. People talk about lost decade for Europe. Maybe this is not exaggeration. European leaders are still struggling with the financial crisis. The third center, focal point, is the global growth center is located in East Asia, in Asia. This growth from East Asia, the whole world needs it. So if that is true, the countries of the regions, they have their best interests served by maintaining East Asia, Asia as global growth center. Outside, people outside of this region, I don't see any power, any group of countries, they have policy to break up the momentum of East Asia growth. So that's true. I think the East Asia countries, yes, they have differences. I think we should not exaggerate differences between East Asia countries. We have territorial dispute, very difficult issues. But remember one thing, there is no hot war here. All parties concerned, they advocate peaceful solution. No country advocate war to resolve this issue. So I think if you look at East Asian countries, China, Japan, Korea, etc., if you look at their relationship in a comprehensive way, you can see immediately their common interests outweigh by far their differences. My last point about the Monroe Doctrine. With all respect for my good friend, Levitte, I think you confuse the different times, different centuries. Monroe Doctrine is 19th century. We are in 21st century. In 19th century, the world was divided, as Thierry said, in a different sphere of influences. But today, the world is so interdependent. Please do not confuse different centuries. Thank you.
Well, Jianmin, thank you very much. Unfortunately, you know, it's impossible to have a... No, sorry, because I want to give the floor to one last speaker. Yes, but no, we will continue to... No, let me just say one thing, you know, which is that the risk in East Asia, both politically and economically, it does not stem from the fact that there is a will on any side to wage a war. The risk comes from the risk of an accident and the rise of nationalist and populist feelings. I will give you one sentence, but after the second and last, unfortunately, intervention.
Thank you, Thierry. John Manley from Canada. And I have a question for Richard Haass to take us back into this European security venue, and it has to do with your distinction between the core of Europe and the periphery of Europe, and NATO membership that has been extended to countries along the Baltic in particular, who are now NATO members. And my question really goes to be provocative, geopolitical engineering, and since we don't name anybody, we have seen adjacent territories actually taken under the jurisdiction of a regional power in the past year. And I'd really like to know whether you see some of our more recent NATO members as part of the periphery or part of the core, and how NATO will respond to the risks that are implicit in that.
Well, thank you very much, John. Let me say that John Manley was, among other things, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Finance of Canada, and he's le patron des patrons today in Canada. So I gave 1 minute to Mr. Oshima. No, I'm glad, because this is that heats a little bit the atmosphere. So but I give you 1 minute and 1 minute to Richard, okay? And then we have to close, because I should not give the wrong example. So,
I'm sorry. I will not take not much time. With due respect to Ambassador Wu, the issue is still very complicated in my view. You see, the point is the shrine was not built to dedicate to the war criminals. It was a dedication to millions of our war dead throughout the history since modern times. So, the leaders are not going to pay respects to the war criminals. They are going there to pay respects to the millions of soldiers and sailors who died. So that is I understand the sentiments expressed by China and people of China. I understand, and of course, we in Japan are very much remorseful of what happened during the war. But the fact that the millions of people, soldiers and sailors, enshrined there, and people would like to pay respects, is almost a natural sentiment, aside from this issue of the war criminals. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. These are, of course, extremely emotional and therefore political subjects. Richard, last word.
I will make 3 points in 1 minute. One is, I think the question of what we just heard goes beyond the shrine and the museum associated with the shrine. It deals with public statements. It deals with textbooks and what is taught in schools. So the shrine is part of the problem, but it's actually a bigger problem. It's coming to terms more broadly with the past. Secondly, Ambassador Wu, I thought Thierry had a very good response to your statement. I think you're too sanguine. You're too relaxed about the Asia security system. It's not a question of whether people have a will. It's the question of whether the system is resilient or brittle. And right now, I would say it's somewhat brittle. There's the possibility of accidents. And one of the things we learned from before World War I, interdependence, as valuable as it is, does not make conflict impossible. What often history is about are countries doing things that are not in their self-interests. And what we need to do is build barriers to that. Thirdly, any country in NATO is definitely part of Europe's core. That to me is not in doubt. I think there's two, though, issues. One is the West and we can still have interests where we don't have formal legal commitments. Ukraine is about that, Kazakhstan, and so forth. And then secondly, Article 5 in NATO, which is the formal obligation of NATO, is clear. I don't believe there can be any compromise with that, but there are scenarios that may be less than that. And one can imagine scenarios where some of the things that Russia has done in Ukraine, one can imagine them doing it in other countries. So I think, again, history is not always black or white. Sometimes the toughest decisions, and you know this, operate in the gray zone. And I do think that we could face some very difficult security challenges, but your basic question is clear. There cannot be any doubt about NATO's willingness and ability, just as important, to defend the countries of whom it's a member. Right now, I have real questions about our ability, and I think one of the real challenges for the United States and the members of NATO is to narrow the gap between NATO's obligations and NATO's capacities.
Well, thank you very much, Richard, and all the panelists. I would like to say first, for those who want to use the translation, that we have a very good translation in the French language, which I checked. So don't hesitate to use it, and vice versa. You know, if some speakers want to speak French, ce qui tout de même n'est pas totalement impossible. And also, I would like to tell the speakers, those who are here and the next ones, that they are all asked to go to, we have a small TV studio, WPC TV, that's the internet. So you are please all invited to give your contribution, but also the participants who are not speakers and panels, and who would like to to give their thoughts on some of the issues which we are debating. So now we are going to switch immediately to the next session because the schedule is a bit tight, but we have, I'm sure, a lot of opportunities to continue various aspects of these discussions. Thank you very much. I think it was an interesting start. So,